Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show you pretty much what your grinding booth is going to look like in the fabrication area of our shop. And then I'm going to give you a real brief rundown on how to operate your grinder and how to change out some of the discs. And just a real quick safety note, remember that whenever you're using an angle grinder, or any grinder for that matter, always use the face shield in addition to your safety glasses. Alright, so the first thing you're going to see when you walk into your booth are the face shields, the plugins, the angle grinder, obviously the work table, and the vise. So whenever you're using an angle grinder, it's always important to use the vise. You want to clamp your material down, that way it's not moving around and it doesn't jump away from you as you're grinding it. In this case, I've got a little tab welded to the back so that way I can fit that into the vise, secure it down, that way you can get the best view possible. So here's your angle grinder. We use pretty much DeWalt. Right here is where the switch is to activate the grinder, and that thing that I'm toggling back and forth is a safety switch. So you have to press that down in order to actually turn the grinder on. Otherwise, if you try to push the switch down, it's not going to work. So you have to toggle that switch and then hit the main button down. So you can see the angle grinder works once you do that. And so I'm going to go ahead and shut the power off to this grinder so that way we don't have any accidents during the demonstration. Then you're going to have a handle which you can twist on and off, and you can put it on the right side if you want to. So, for those of us who are right-handed or left-handed, we can go ahead and switch that handle around. And you'll notice that the disc spins clockwise and counterclockwise while it's not in use. While you're actually using it, it's going to be spinning clockwise. So as the grinder faces away from you, that disc is going to spin to the right, or as I said, clockwise. But if you turn the grinder around to where you're facing the disc, it's going to spin to your left, or counterclockwise. So while the grinder is not being used, the disc can spin freely back and forth as part of a feature that allows you to disconnect the disc. And I'm going to show you that here in a second. Just let me remove the handle so you can get a better view of what I'm doing. So there's a button up on the head of the grinder, and every grinder has this button. It may look different, it may be on a different location on the grinder, but it's always going to be up towards the front, and it always serves the same purpose. It locks the disc in place. So you can see I'm pushing the button down, and I'm going to rotate it just a little bit, and once you find that sweet spot, that button's going to go in the rest of the way. Then as I turn this angle grinder around, you're going to see this silver disc right in the middle. That's what we call the Arbor insert, and it's got 4 holes in it, 4 orifices. Now what you're going to do while the disc is locked in place is you're going to come in with a certain tool that has 2 prongs on it, and you're going to fit those 2 prongs into any 2 of the orifices, and you're basically going to twist that Arbor insert counterclockwise, or you can think of it in terms of righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So once you loosen that Arbor insert, you just spin it off, pull the disc off that you have on there currently, put on either a new disc or a different disc depending on what you're using it for, put that Arbor insert back on, and then tighten it while holding the button down and using the tool. And once you've done that, you're ready to go. Now let's talk about this guard right here. This guard is another safety feature for the angle grinder. It does a couple different things. It keeps the sparks and the debris from flying back at you, and you can also reposition it so that way it prevents sparks and debris from flying out against certain objects that could be around you during grinding operations. Now sometimes, depending on the position in which you're grinding, it can get in the way. But the number one thing to remember is that you should never remove this. This is there for your safety. So if you remove it, you're taking a risk of something happening, and we don't want that to happen. So if you need to reposition it, I'm going to show you how. So again, if we look towards the head of the grinder, right above the grinding disc, or the cutting disc in this situation, you're going to see a little clamp. And so what we're going to do is we're going to undo that clamp, and that's going to allow us to rotate the guard. And so as the guard spins freely, go ahead and find the position that best suits whatever you're going to be doing in the moment. Once it's in position, go ahead and lock that clamp back down, and you're ready to go. What you see here is the two-prong tool that I was mentioning before that's going to allow you to remove grinding discs, cutting discs, flap discs, whatever it is that you currently have on your grinder, and interchange them as you need for whatever operations that you're conducting. So remember to lock your disc in place, and then once you've done that, go ahead and fit the tool into the two orifices that it will fit into, and then spin counterclockwise. And so this one's screwed on there pretty tight, so I'm going to have to put a little bit more elbow grease into it. And so you can see that once you loosen the arbor insert, you can go ahead and just spin it off by hand, and then you can take off, in this case, the cutting disc. So in case you're not used to the various discs that can be used on an angle grinder, I've got two here for you. One of them is a grinding disc, and that's this one that I'm kind of holding closer to the camera. So it's a lot thicker than a cutting disc. This is used for heavy material removal. This is when you really need to remove material in a timely manner. One thing about the grinding disc, though, is that it produces a rough cut on the surface of the material that you're grinding. So it's definitely not one to be used for polishing. Now this blue one is called a flap disc. You can think of it in terms of a juiced up sanding disc. It comes in many different grits. So if I flip the flap disc over to look at what the grit is, you can see that it's 40 grit. So it's going to give you somewhat of a rough grind, but it's also going to produce a little bit of a polishing effect. And then we can go in with higher grit flap discs afterwards and polish it up even more. And whereas giving you a rough grind, it's not going to be as bad as the actual grinding disc itself. And at this point, I'm going to put on the grinding disc so that way we can just continue on with our grinding operations. So you just take the grinding disc, put it onto the grinder, it basically just slips on. And as we look a little closer, you're going to see that there's a little bit of a gap in between that inner diameter of the hole for the grinding disc. And if we take a look at the arbor insert, you're going to see that it's got a little bit of a lip on there towards the inside. And so that is to safely secure the grinding disc to the angle grinder. And if I flip that arbor insert over, you can see that on the reverse side, it's more of a flat surface. Now, if you were going to use something like a cutting disc that is much thinner than a grinding disc, you would flip it around and have the flat side touching the disc, and then screw it on to secure the disc. But if you're ever unsure, most arbor inserts actually write on there which side to use depending on what disc you're using. And this one actually says this side against 1/4 inch wheels. And most grinding discs are approximately 1/4 inch in thickness. So in this case, we would know which side of the arbor insert to face against the grinding disc in order to secure it in place. So then you go ahead and just screw the arbor insert back on. And once you've gotten the arbor insert to about, finger tight, go ahead and push that retention button in so that way you can lock the disc in place and tighten it up the rest of the way using the tool. All right, so now that we've safely secured our grinding disc to the angle grinder, let's go ahead and get to work. And a real quick notice, whenever you're using an angle grinder, it's always best to use gloves, especially while you're on campus. Always use gloves while you're using the angle grinder. Make sure that they are leather gloves or some sort of work gloves. Don't use anything synthetic. Don't use any latex gloves or anything like that. You always want to make sure that they are work gloves. And then remember, I've got this tab welded to the backside of these two plates that have been welded together. That's going to allow me to clamp it into the vise face up so that way you can see just exactly what I'm doing. And once you've secured the material in the vise, go ahead and make sure it's nice and tight in there. Go ahead and crank it just a little bit more. Not too much, though, to where you think you're about to break the vise, but I'll leave that to your better judgment. And we're going to do a quick grinder check. I've turned on the power, so we're just making sure that it works. And it works, so let's keep on moving. Now, when you're using an angle grinder, there's a reason why they include angle in the name. You always want to approach the material that you're grinding at an angle with your grinder. Now, you can grind the material when your grinder is flat up against it, but you're not going to get too far because you have to remember the arbor insert. If that makes contact with the material, you're going to damage the arbor insert and potentially damage the grinder, and you're just not really going to get too far across the material in order to grind the entire surface. And so as you're grinding your material, go ahead and move the grinder back and forth across the surface of your plates or whatever it happens to be that you're grinding until you feel satisfied with the amount of material that you've grinded off. What's important to note here is that you shouldn't push too hard on the grinder. You should always allow the tool to do the work for you. And once you're done using the grinder, it's important to let that disc come to a complete stop before putting the grinder onto your table. And when you're setting it onto the table, you never want to put it grinding or a cutting disc down, face down on the table, because that switch might accidentally get activated and you don't want a grinder to turn on while it's sitting down. You always want to set it down with the disc facing up. And of course, always remember, wear your face shield.